There's a high risk of severe transboundary haze in Singapore and the surrounding region. Now, that's according to local think tank Singapore Institute of International Affairs. It's the first time in its annual report launched 5 years ago that the risk was raised to the highest scale. Now, a closer look at why that's the case. For one, the return of the El Niño weather event. Now, that means lower rainfall and hotter conditions, which are conducive to the development of vegetation fires. Now, this ultimately leads to a higher haze risk. Now, as for market conditions, prices of agricultural commodities like palm oil seeds, well, they have remained high past the pandemic, and that's spurring plantation operators to clear land for planting activities via slash and burn techniques. And that raises the risk as well of severe haze. Government policies are also a factor. The report highlights how Indonesia and Malaysia are improving systems to prevent fires and deforestation. But it also points out that the upcoming general elections in Indonesia could see resources diverted away from haze prevention. Still, it's noted that regional economies have strong sustainability commitments in place. And these include, for instance, nationwide measures to prevent open burning, carbon regulations, as well as close cooperation between governments and the private sector. Now, for more on this story, we have with us in the studio Professor Simon Tay. He's chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Good evening to you. Simon, it's good to see you again. Thank you for coming into the studios. You're using this traffic light system to actually predict the strength of what an anticipated haze might be should we see it. Can you explain something to us about this traffic light system and why it's been necessary?
Well, the report actually is based on quite detailed and quantitative analysis of the weather, the government policies, and also market trends. And on top of the quantitative analysis, we also do a lot of interviews with officials when we host them or meet them in Jakarta or KL. And we talk to the large companies. So we really get a sense of the quantitative and the qualitative. But after all that research, we felt it essential for a call for action. And for a call for action to really reach out, we thought we had to kind of simplify it. I mean, not to oversimplify or treat people like idiots, but to send a strong signal. I'm glad you got it right, Dawn. The summary is correct. This is the first time in 5 years we're calling for a red risk, severe risk of severe haze returning to the region. And we want to say that it's primarily driven by the weather. We've been feeling it already, and it's coming to the dry season. So the risks are really quite real.
As Don was also mentioning, it was as green, amber, and then red.
Yes.
So if this is a call for action, the fact that we've now hit red, what kind of action should countries be taking, as opposed to if it were amber, as an example?
Well, first of all, I would say that one reason it is red is the weather. And that's really a bit of everyone's control. At the most, we can say that people are predicting and what the scale of prediction is. But in response to that, we mustn't give up and be fatalistic. We must see that government action, corporate action, these all can have a positive effect. It may not get rid of the problem, but can ameliorate, make it less severe. So I must credit Indonesia. Over these years, I've been watching them, have really improved their policies and their implementation. This year alone, early this year, President Jokowi has already warned officials that if there's fire, there will be sackings. Madam Siti Nurbaya, the Minister of Environment and Forestry in Indonesia, the point person, has actually taken the step of suing errant companies. And these are different, much better, tougher action than the past. Nearby Malaysia too, their Minister for Environment has called out companies and warned of the severity coming up. So I would say that this red alarm should not be surprising to our governments around us. Here in Singapore too, early on, the National Environment Agency, which I used to chair, has signalled there is a real risk and asked us to all start to prepare, getting masks and air purifiers we want, because of course we have no plantations to police. So we have to depend on our neighbours, but there are things we can do for ourselves.
So despite the number of things that have been done to mitigate the risks, the work that's been done, overseas as well in regional governments to sort of tamp down the possibility of haze over the years. I'm speaking from as far back as 2014, 2015, when we saw the worst of it. There are these threads that are coming together, the policies that are coming together, the market conditions as well as the fact of El Nino. So tell us a little bit more about how the studies were actually done.
Yes. So first, as I mentioned, we've looked at the El Nino factors. We're not weather people ourselves, but we've studied all the reports coming out from Japan, from America, and we also look at some of the ground data. Today, you can get actual readings of where the hotspots are, what the water rainfall patterns are, what the level of water is in the peatlands, which cause a lot of this haze. So our team, of which I chair, but I do not do the science myself, I must say they've really dug into the quantitative data. On top of that, the interviews with top companies which have really dedicated much resources, money, and time to put out fires, to prevent fires. And I think these are really positive signs. Dawn, you mentioned 2015. I would say that unless there's a truly severe, really like the top end of the severity of the haze, of the El Nino, we're unlikely to see that bad. We're talking about 2019, but we're coming off the back of 3 very wet years. These years have seen both wet weather, which is better to prevent fires, but also much more action, institution building and policy by the Indonesian and Malaysian governments. So I don't want to be too pessimistic. I think that the structures Indonesia has built are a bit like I don't know how sturdy they are, but they are certainly an improvement over what we had before 2015. So a bit like that classic fairy tale of the little pigs. Is your house built of straw? Is a bit of brick? Maybe ours is a sturdy wooden structure, but a wooden structure can catch fire.
So these structures that are in place, they are as sturdy, they are much more sturdy than they were in 2015. But we all know each government always has its own domestic concerns. So you want to get tough on environment, you have to consider the domestic economy, the domestic workforce. From your point of view, when you speak to different governments, what is holding them back most and what more can they do given these constraints?
Well, first, I want to say that the finger is pointing to the weather, the El Nino. I do not point a finger at the Indonesian government of Jokowi. In fact, quite reverse, I want to credit them. They've really built institutions and efforts to fund conservation projects. They've seen that the risk of fire is actually the mirror image of the opportunity to conserve, to create nature-based solutions, carbon credits, and to really pull in resources, investments from the public sector, but also private investments to really twin growth with better protection of the environment. I also say that satellite images show that the rate of deforestation in Indonesia has gone down. So coming off this wet weather, they also have put a lot of progress in place. This will be a severe test. The second part is that the countries that used to bicker have learned to have a good dialogue and recently held a meeting here in Singapore. But like all times of stress, I'm hoping that the differences and potential haze won't lead again to fracture. We've got to keep working on this together. The countries that own the plantations will have to take action, but I hope they'll be transparent and cooperative in their approach.
Protection of the peatlands is going to be very important in all of this as well. Thank you, Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.